Throughout this semester, we've been looking at the value of goods in terms of other goods, right? We're looking at the choices that consumers make, and even when we looked at the production possibility frontier, we're looking at the choices that business make one item or another. So as we look at it from the business perspective, we need to recognize that before businesses can decide how much they're willing to make and at what price, they're first going to have to consider what to make. So here we're looking at how do businesses decide what to specialize in? And why do businesses decide to specialize? Why don't they make everything in a broad range of things? Why do they make a small group of related items? So when we look at what can a business produce, what are the choices? Right? Businesses can make goods or services. And if they make goods, they can make what type of goods? Consumer goods and capital goods. Okay. Then businesses can decide how they're going to make those goods, right? How do businesses decide how to make something? They have to consider the cost, right? Scarcity, the opportunity cost of those factors of production. They have to consider productivity of those factors of production. So we're going to be looking at cost and productivity in some later videos. But right now, let's look at how we decide what to make in terms of why we specialize. Well, businesses, they can make thousands of different items. Instead, they tend to create a small group of related items. So let's think about why this is. Okay, so let's think of an example. In Red Deer, there is a company called Fletcher's Printing, and they make posters and brochures. Well, why do they focus just on printing posters and brochures? Why don't they make the soap and the toilets that their employees use? Okay. Well, the challenge is that if you have to make everything, then there's an opportunity cost, a sacrifice. So the time that's spent making the toilet paper your employees use, that's time and effort that you're not using to make your printing your brochures and things like that. And you probably are better at making one thing than you are at another. We also have economies of scale. That is, if we can make more of one item, we can lower the per unit cost than if we make a little bit of everything. So we tend to specialize because of that opportunity cost, that sacrifice, when we start to make multiple different things. And this is true whether you're looking at it from the business perspective or whether you're looking at it from a country perspective. And so we're going to take a small detour in our microeconomics discussion about businesses and individual businesses and go bigger and look at it from a country perspective. So why do countries specialize? Why don't countries all each make everything themselves? Why do they specialize and trade? Well, it's really the same reason that businesses specialize and then buy everything else. So Fletcher's is going to make brochures and posters and then buy everything else they need. They're not going to make the paper themselves. They're not going to make the toilet paper and the toilets in their bathrooms. They're going to specialize. And it really does come down to that idea of opportunity cost and the sacrifice that you're making. So we want to figure out, how do we know what to specialize in? So we're going to look at some different theories in terms of how do you decide what to focus on and why. Well, as I said, we're going to start it from the bigger picture approach by looking at it from the country perspective. But just one more note here, think about your own life. You specialize. When you're deciding on a career in accounting, you are specializing in accounting. You're not doing everything. If we did everything, we would have to make our own bread, build our own house, build our own car, do all the maintenance on our own car, grow all of our food, right? Do you do all those things? Probably not. Probably you buy or rent a house someone else built. You buy or rent a car that someone else made. You probably don't grow all of your food from scratch. You buy some of it at the grocery store. Why do you do that? You do that because it takes time and effort and all those different things. And so it's more worth your time to specialize in something you're really good at, that you can do well, and then buy everything else. Okay, so let's go to that bigger perspective. So let's look at it from a country perspective. Why do countries specialize in trade? Maybe we should just close the border and we'll make everything we need in-house. Well, already you can think of some problems with that, right? Because in Canada, we can't grow pineapples and bananas because of our climate. So making everything ourselves is going to really limit what we have access to. By specializing in trading, we're going to find that we have access to more and better quality, more variety of goods and services. But what if we did just close the border? Okay, there's been lots of arguments over time about how we should have more of a protectionist policy. That is, protect local jobs and keep out those foreign goods. Well, as we talk about those foreign goods, we need to talk about the idea of exports and imports. So let's just define a couple items here. So let's start with the idea of imports. When we talk about imports, what we're doing is we're taking goods produced in another country and we are bringing them in. So if we're looking at this from a Canadian perspective, the goods are produced in another country and they're going to be sold here in Canada. Whereas exports are goods made, if we're looking at it from the Canadian perspective, made here in Canada and sold in other countries. So we might sell those goods to other countries or to the people in them or to businesses in them. But imports, the goods are coming in. Exports, the goods are going out. So if we're looking at Canada, tell me, what are the goods that we import? So what is it that we primarily bring into Canada? And what is it that we primarily ship out? Well, here we have the top imports and exports. So notice the primary thing we bring in is consumer goods, followed by electronic equipment and automotive products. What do we primarily export? Automotive products, consumer goods, metal products, and you can see energy products in there as well. So low oil prices has made energy products fall to number 5 on the list. It used to be up in the top in 1 or 2. But notice the list. These are the same things on the imports and the exports list, automotive products. And that's because countries and companies specialize and trade. So for example, Toyota specializes when it comes to their vehicles. They make some in the US, they make some in Canada, and then they move them across the border. So the RAV4, the Corolla are made in Canada. The Tundra, the Camry are made in the US, and then they sell them in both locations. So we have a lot of vehicles moving back and forth across the border because countries and companies specialize and then buy everything else. Well, let's look a little bit deeper at this issue of these vehicles going back and forth across the border. So we said, should we just make everything ourselves? Well, the idea of this protectionist policy to protect local jobs has led to a number of tariffs or taxes on the movement of goods across borders. So countries like the US can put a tariff on steel, and that is going to impact then when Canadian steel comes into the US. So that means that Canadian steel is more expensive than any US produced steel, and it impacts a company like Ford when they go to produce vehicles. The idea here is to protect American jobs, those steel manufacturing jobs, as well as to encourage the companies to buy local. Americans buy American produced items. Well, the challenge, as we saw with automobile products, is that they move back and forth between Canada, between the US, between Mexico. And so what that does is it's having an impact on the price of vehicles for everyone. Okay, so it's driving up the cost of vehicles as these parts of cars and cars move back and forth across the country. So what we're seeing is that some of the most popular American cars are going to cost thousands of dollars more because of these tariffs. And this is a US news site. So it's US to the US customer, the cars are going to cost more. Okay. So we have advocates for free trade. That is, let's reduce the barriers to trade so that we can all specialize and buy everything else, and then we can all have more access to goods and services. So we're going to be looking at this debate on the idea of free trade, and if we're really better off if we specialize and buy everything else instead of make everything else ourselves. But while the tariffs on vehicles and steel is more recent, this is a long existing issue. So, for example, US and Canada have had issues on trade related to the manufacturing of aircraft. So the US claims that Bombardier in Canada is being unfair in the competition because the Canadian government provides subsidies and help to Bombardier, which lowers the costs and means that they can charge a lower price for their airplanes compared to aircraft that are produced in the US. So what that turns into then is it turns into an issue with trade, because then the US wants to add a duty or a tax, a tariff, on Canadian-made aircraft. And the challenge whenever this happens is that it tends to turn into a tit for tat or retaliative process. So, for example, if we go back to 2009, during the 2008-2009 recession, the US was going to pass a Buy America Act. The idea here is that in order to use government money to help stimulate the economy, then any infrastructure, any government-funded events to help stimulate the economy had to be American-made products. So again, we're back to the steel debate. And currently 30% of Canadian-produced steel is sold to the US. So this is back in 2009, 2010. 30% of steel, of Canadian steel, went to the US. But the problem with this Buy America Act is that any of this infrastructure building, so we'll build a hospital with government funding to create jobs to stimulate the economy, would have to be American-made steel. Well, the US imports $30 billion of steel per month. Okay, so in the US, 25% of the steel used in the US comes from Canada. Right? Lots of trade between our two societies. Well, this threatens not only the trade between, but when Canada hears that there's going to be a Buy America Act, how do you think they respond? Well, the Canadian mayors wanted to pass an anti-Buy American resolution. The idea here is that if the US is going to put a tariff on steel, then Canada's going to retaliate by putting tariffs on other products. And we've actually seen that in the last couple of years. There was, for example, tariffs put on some products like ketchup and mustard and some of those products where Canada was retaliating against US tariffs. So it tends to turn into this dispute, and then we're no longer having free trade. And now we're no longer able to specialize and buy everything else because the foreign products become cost prohibitive. So how do you think this ended up? right? So if the US is saying, let's create this act where we're going to buy only American products, and Canada says, if you do that, then we're going to create this Buy Canada Act where we're now going to tax all these items from the US. So now no one's going to buy the American items. So no one's buying each other's stuff. Well, what happened was when the US went and passed their Buy America Act, there's in the fine print a little exclusion that says Buy American or Canadian. So the problem when we start to disrupt trade is that it starts to get expensive for everybody. Because if you put tariffs on the foreign goods, so they're more expensive, so you buy local. The problem is we do so much trading back and forth that even the local goods become more expensive. And the other country will retaliate. They'll put taxes on your goods, so then no one's buying your stuff, right? So why do we specialize and trade? And are we better off if we specialize and trade? Well, before we leave kind of this discussion here about Canadian trade, who do you think we bring most of our goods in from? What country do we import most of our goods from? Well, we import 61.5% of our goods from the US, and China is second at 9.3%. Well, who do we export? Who do we sell our goods to? We export 69.2% of our goods to the US, with China here at 6% of our exports, and the UK at 4.8%. So the reason we start to care about these tariffs with the US and our trade with the US is they are our number one trading partner. And this is the same reason that we really care about whether the economy in the US is growing or shrinking, because whenever the economy in the US grows or shrinks, it's going to pull the Canadian economy with it because we're so intertwined. Do we want to be so intertwined? Perhaps we should not specialize and trade. Perhaps we should make everything ourselves. We're going to be looking at that in the next couple videos.